Welcome back. Not all Muslims are terrorists, but all terrorists are Muslim. So goes the popular saying. We certainly hear a lot about the association between terrorism and Muslims in the media and in public discourse. But is it true? Not according to the latest research, says Azeezah Kanji. Azeezah is a graduate of the University of Toronto Law School and programming coordinator at Neurocultural Center. I'm here with her now to discuss her findings. Azeezah, welcome to Let the Quran Speak.
Thank you, Sophia. Thank you for having me.
Now, what's going on, this association between Muslim and terrorism? You're saying it doesn't really exist. What's happening here? Explain it.
First of all, I think it's important to question the very category of terrorism in the first place. I think we often take it for granted that there is this specific category of violence called terrorism. And we take it for granted that it's evident that some types of violence are terrorism, whereas other types of violence are not terrorism. Whereas before the 1970s, this discourse about terrorism didn't really exist in North America. Things like plane hijackings were called crimes, for example. And so I think it's important to question, first of all, the category of terrorism, because not all political violence that is directed against civilians is called terrorism. We generally don't call violence committed by states against civilians terrorism. We didn't call, for example, the Elliot Rodgers shootings directed against women. That wasn't called terrorism.
So how does terrorism get associated with Islam then?
Well, so I think terrorism functions as a label that's put on certain kinds of violence committed by certain kinds of actors to portray it from the beginning as being an illegitimate form of violence and a particularly barbaric and almost mad form of violence, a crazy form of violence. The discourse around terrorism is that these terrorists they're in a clash of civilizations mentality. They hate the West. They hate us for our freedoms. It's a very us against them, Manichaean type of conflict. And so what terrorism does is that it functions to illegitimize and make insensible certain kinds of violence just by applying the label to it. And then what gets missed in this type of narrative around terrorism are the political reasons, for example, why people engage in terrorism, the types of grievances that they're trying to address through violence, and instead it's portrayed as a problem of fundamentalist Islam gone wild, which really ignores, for example, what terrorists say about why they're committing terrorism. But then even within the discourse of what we're labeling terrorism, it's simply not the case that the majority of terrorist attacks in Europe and North America have been committed by Muslims. And this has been demonstrated by multiple studies. The most recent was a report produced by Europol, which is the policing agency of the European Union, and hardly an organization known for its pro-Muslim sentiments. It's not a biased Islamophilic organization in that way. And what that report showed was that in 2013, as in previous years, the vast majority of incidents, of violent incidents labeled terrorist, were from separatist and proto-nationalist groups, not by Muslims. In fact, only 1.3% of terrorist attacks committed in 2013 were by Muslims. And so in Europe, according to those reports, the majority of attacks are from separatist groups, from right-wing and left-wing extremist violence, not from Muslims. And yet this report didn't receive any coverage in North American media. And in fact, reports produced by Public Safety Canada insist on maintaining that the majority of terrorist attacks committed in North America and Europe after 9/11 have been committed by Muslims without citing any statistics, because if they had, those statistics would have patently undermined that claim. These reports from the European Union countries are supported by research that has been conducted by Dr. Charles Kurtzman, who's a sociologist at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And in reports that he has produced annually for the Triangle Center on Terrorism and National Security, he has found that year after year, deaths and incidents of Muslim American terrorism are very low. Prior to 2013, when the Boston Marathon bombing was reported in his terrorism statistics, the previous fatal Muslim terrorist attack was in 2009 at Fort Hood, when Major Nidal Hassan opened fire, killing several people. Since 2001, 37 Americans have been killed by Muslim American terrorists. In that same period, there have been 190,000 murders and 200 Americans killed from right-wing white supremacist political violence. And yet these are not the incidents of terrorism that we hear about in our news. And in fact, even while the Boston bombing has been commemorated on its annual anniversary, for example, and it's consistently cited as the example of the domestic threat from Muslim American terrorism. In the year that occurred, there were 30 mass murders with 4 or more casualties in that year. And the shooting with the greatest number of casualties was in the Washington Navy Yard, which had 12 casualties. And yet these are not remembered as examples of domestic terrorism, and they're not held up as demonstrating this paradigmatic terrorist threat, which we supposedly face from Muslims, so that Muslims are represented as constituting the major threat of violence in Canada and North America.
So why do you think this is the case, that there's such a strong connection in the West between Islam and terrorism, whereas that connection doesn't really exist?
I think it's all part of this framing of the war on terror, in which Muslims are portrayed, no matter where they are, as a threat to women, to civilians, as terrorists. And so the war on terror has expanded now from Afghanistan and Iraq to drone attacks in Somalia and Yemen. And it's all part of this discourse which supports violence committed against Muslims abroad, as well as surveillance and violence on Muslims domestically, by portraying them as the predominant threat to our safety and security, not only here but everywhere in the world. And so, in fact, the most recent Public Safety Canada report on the terrorist threat in Canada is completely concerned with the Muslim threat, whereas previous reports included, a sentence or two about the fact that white supremacists also engage in political violence in Canada. And in fact, RCMP and CSIS officers have stated that white supremacist violence is actually a greater concern than violence or political violence committed by Muslim Canadians. And yet, these entire reports, without citing any statistical evidence or giving any real idea of numbers, are completely and utterly, absolutely concerned with the threat that's posed by Muslims acting here, as well as going abroad to fight in foreign conflicts in ISIS and then returning and being radicalized. And so this is really a narrative that's maintained at several levels, from our national security apparatus and the public reports they present, in our media, in our news media, as well as in popular media. And it's very intimately connected to the economies and the politics of the global war on terror.
I'm intrigued by your mention of popular media. Can you talk about that a little bit more?
So there are several television shows, such as Homeland 24, which are very concerned with this lurking threat of Muslim terrorism. And this is supported by the narrative that's presented in our news media, which is actually more pernicious because it can't be dismissed as entertainment. It's thought of as representing the facts of the matter. And so, for example, on the CBC, they had a segment called The Enemy Within. Very charged language that has been used historically in order to demonize and present as foreign certain groups that are constructed as internal enemies. And this segment, The Enemy Within, was all about the threat posed by Muslim Canadians radicalizing and turning to terrorism. And the segment really presented this as an unknowable threat, that we don't know how many Muslims are radicalizing, and we can't tell which ones are radicalized. It's very difficult to discern which ones are dangerous and which ones aren't. And it showed images of Muslim men at barbecues putting ketchup on hamburgers with a voiceover saying, we don't know which ones are dangerous and we don't know when they'll turn, and we can try to fight this threat, but it's just a flood and we don't know how many. Without actually saying how many, they don't actually give any sense of the statistical scope of the problem or how it compares to other threats that we face in Canada, from white supremacist violence, from patriarchal violence, as well as from all these other structural forms of violence that are embedded in our economic practices. So workplace practices which endanger workers, for example, or violence against our Indigenous communities. All of these forms of violence which are structural and endemic in Canada. The threat of Muslim terrorism is held up as being different in kind and in degree from any of these other forms of violence, which are actually more deadly, and is used to justify the practices of the national security state and surveillance against Muslim communities.
Mm-hmm. Now, the discourse, from what I'm getting from you, the discourse about Muslims is at such a low point. I mean, who's responsible for changing that? Would you say it's Muslims? Would you say, you know, the wider society? Who exactly?
I think several different groups have a part to play. As Muslims, I think we certainly need to be more educated about the actual facts and scopes of problems with radicalization and the relationship between radicalization and propensity for violence, which actually is not clear-cut. But as Muslims, we also consume mainstream media, and we're affected by these narratives, and we often internalize them and reproduce them. So I think as Muslims, it's essential that we ourselves become more educated about adopting a critical perspective towards national security practices which racialize and demonize Muslims. I think it's also important to form coalitions and alliances with other groups that have been racialized and targeted by the surveillance state. Indigenous groups, for example, have been targeted by the Harper government for surveillance. And these surveillance practices now are being expanded to cover all demonstrations. A memo was leaked recently in the National Post about this. Mm-hmm. And so I think that there is plenty of opportunity for alliances. And because at the end of the day, even though Muslims now are bearing the brunt of the oppressive practices of the national security state, at the end of the day, these practices really dampen down on all kind of opposition and expressions of dissent, which really is a threat to our ability to function as a critical and progressive society.
Azeezah, thank you so much for sharing these insights with us. They're groundbreaking. Thank you for that.
Oh, thank you, Sophia.
That's all time we have, so we'll have to end it here. I'm sad to say that this is my last day on the show. It has truly been an honor to serve as host of Let the Quran Speak. If you're interested in being the new host of Let the Quran Speak, check out our website, QuranSpeaks.com, to view the job description. I hope you'll stay in touch, and I hope you'll continue to support Let the Quran Speak as it advances in the months and years to come. I'm Sophia Ali. Thank you for watching and for sharing this wonderful journey with me.